President Trump, tried very hard, bent over backwards to try and accommodate him and tried to fashion a ceasefire with President Putin, as you know. And the Ukrainians almost immediately broke the ceasefire, violated it. And all the statements they've made, everything coming out of Ukraine has been vitriol directed at us. And it's impossible to develop or formulate any sort of peace agreement with this man in power. I think he should be removed. And if we're not going to do that, then I think we have to get out. We have to simply leave Ukraine, because this man is a danger at this point to everyone, because you have President Putin who said, yes, we want to end this war, and we want to end the war. And you have these irresponsible actors in London and Paris who think that somehow or another, by threatening to go it alone, that we can be goaded into supporting them. That's absurd. Any European that tries to move European forces into Western Ukraine is going to fail, because they can't do anything without us. So the whole idea is appalling. Zelensky is appalling. President Trump needs to pull the plug on this man.
You mentioned that he has been spitting in Trump's face for a while. You may recall it was some number of months back. It may have been just after Trump had assumed power, and Zelensky is complaining that Trump is being manipulated by Putin, which of course harkened back to the whole issue of the Russiagate and all the charges that went with that. So it didn't sit well with the president. Well, turns out he's done it again. And this is from the Ukraine media from today. He's actually complaining that Russia has managed to influence some in the White House. Zelensky tells Time magazine, and they had that big spread on him. I think the third one they've had during the war, which is not a very attractive portrait of him, I would say. But it stuns me that you're going to tell Time magazine again, especially in light of what's already happened twice. And he's going to make these kinds of condescending comments. What does that tell you about where the mind of Zelensky is?
Zelensky is behaving the way he is because he has support from people inside the Beltway, not just in Paris and London, but also inside the Beltway, and sadly, increasingly from Berlin. Look, President Trump needs to make it very clear that he will not support this conflict any longer. As soon as he does that and terminates any and all military aid to Ukraine, I think Zelensky and his friends will begin filling up their duffel bags with cash and looking for planes, trains, and automobiles out of Ukraine. These people are corrupt. The people in Washington that are taking his side are the same people that helped to start this war in Ukraine. They don't deserve any attention whatsoever. President Trump was elected because he is viewed as someone who actually cares about the individual American citizen, as someone who shares the views, the attitudes, the interests of the average American. He knows Americans are completely disinterested in going to war for any reason with anybody over Ukraine. He knows that. So he needs to brush off Zelensky like this sort of annoying gnat that he is, and he needs to effectively ignore these voices inside the Beltway who have been lining their pockets with cash as a result of this horrific war and the deaths of 1.2 million Ukrainian soldiers and 100,000 dead Russians. This has got to stop. The only way to stop that is to end the aid and to pull all of the Americans in and out of uniform that are in Ukraine right now out of Ukraine. That's what needs to happen. There's no other solution. And the sooner he does it, the better for Europe, the better for everyone.
So now, obviously, they're in the process right now of having negotiations. Yeah, that's what one of our viewers mentioned a minute ago. That's Moscow Burning in part of that Time magazine there, where Zelensky's attempting to send a signal, but I don't think it's working quite the way you hope that it would. But I think that, again, that just shows you where he's at in this. While we're trying to negotiate peace, he's intentionally sending something that's very provocative signal to Moscow, which is obviously also what he has been doing. You mentioned one a minute ago where he fired a bunch of drones at some energy infrastructure within hours of the last negotiations after he had agreed to try to seek a negotiated settlement, et cetera. But then what about the United States? Because Trump is putting a whole bunch of energy into this right now. For example, yesterday there was reportedly a 12-hour session at the technical level with the Russians. And so the question is, should Trump just say, all right, you know what, just forget about all that. We're going to do what Doug MacGregor just said. How does he uncouple from what he's been doing?
Well, first and foremost, President Trump's strategic objective is to normalize relations with Russia. That's very important. You know, that's something that he wanted to do during his first term, was unable to do it. Now is his opportunity. There is no reason for conflict between us and Moscow. None. No reason whatsoever. This conflict in Ukraine was cultivated and artificially developed by a small number of people from Washington inside the intelligence services, the CIA, MI6, and so forth, who had an agenda. And this agenda goes back to the end of the Cold War, which is how do we destabilize, undermine, and destroy Russia? That was never President Trump's goal. He wants nothing to do with that. That has to be kept in mind. And his number one goal, which is normalization of relations with Russia, should be the all overarching, all encompassing objective. Whatever else happens shrinks to insignificance next to that. Secondly, I'm sure the Russians have sorted through in great detail what they want to keep, what they're willing to give up, and what they want Ukraine to look like after the war is over. We've never really made that clear. The people that started the war, they wanted to destroy Russia and at the same time reconquer the Crimea and make Ukraine this allegedly liberal democratic utopia that would operate as an armed force in perpetuity against Russia. It's all nonsense. That's all failed. So we have to look at what the Russians say they need and say they want, because the Russians live there. They live next to Ukraine. We do not. Our interest ought to be in a neutral Ukraine. The most important thing for us from the very beginning was that this Ukrainian neutrality operate as a bridge between us and Russia, between Europe and Russia. It becomes a neutral ground where there will be no fighting, no military forces, no military competition. And that's something that's very desirable because we want to end any future possibility of war in the region. That's the Russian goal. Now, I haven't seen the details that you spoke of, but I'm sure the Russians are very, very detailed in what they would like to see happen. And without seeing that, I can't evaluate where we should say yes or no. But I think we have to understand the Russians have won this war. And if you're going to tell the Russians no, you have to go back to square one. We're not going to do business with you. The Russians will cross the river and move west. I suspect they'll move to Odessa and they'll move into Kiev. And now at that point, they'll probably stop and there'll be a resumption of movement further west until, if necessary, they've gone all that distance in order to guarantee there is no threat to them inside Ukraine. That's not what they want to do. That's what they will do. We need to understand that. And saying that they can't do that or they're not strong enough, that's a lot of nonsense. Hopefully, we've learned by now, Dan, Russia is quite capable of doing what it says.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see if they demonstrate that on the ground. We see the potential out there, but I honestly thought they would have done it many months ago because the weakened side of the Ukraine. But it appears that, and I've seen a lot of this on some Russian media and Telegram channels, that there's a lot of frustration on the Russian military side. Is the same thing as you and I thought. They also think, and of course, according to these guys, they see that they have the capacity and they wonder why it's not being employed, while they're still saying after this basically platoon and squad size nibbling on the edges to continue to moving forward, as opposed to big arrow kind of movements, which they haven't even attempted.
Well,
One thing,
Dan, what we need to keep in mind is that without us, the Europeans can do nothing. They don't have the command and control structure. They don't have the space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets. They cannot move their forces into Western Ukraine and present any formidable obstacle to Russian military power without us.
I don't think they could do it with us either, though, on the ground.
Well, that may be true, but from our standpoint, that's an easy solution.
Yeah.
You tell London and Paris, if you're that stupid and this is what you want to do, bear in mind, we're not going. And you get us out of Ukraine. And at the end of the day, the Russians who live there, the Russians who own the terrain, the Russians who have historically dominated that part of the world for hundreds of years are going to do so in the future. We need to come to terms with that. That's not a bad thing necessarily for us by any means. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing for Europeans if what remains of Ukraine when the war is over is neutral. And
Right.
that has to be driven across again and again and again.